Greetings, friends. This is Ian McKenzie here, founder and host of the Mythic Masculine podcast. And I am joined by my dear friend, collaborator, Deus Fortier. Welcome, Deus.
Thanks, Ian. It's good to be here, as always.
And the intention of this conversation is to um, really to explore a, I would call it like a cultural zeitgeist moment, a wave around particular themes that a podcast episode from a fellow named Aubrey Marcus and his two partners, which we'll get into in a moment, released about 2 weeks or so ago, I believe. The podcast episode is called A New Pattern of Sacred Relationship. And you may not know who Aubrey Marcus is, or maybe you do. In certain circles, he's fairly well known as he's kind of an entrepreneur, influencer, uh, burner into psychedelics. He kind of sits at the epicenter of a number of a particular subculture, but a kind of, yeah, I don't know what to call it, psychedelic, crypto, entrepreneurial, biohacking. Like it's just, there's a lot of convalescence, convergence of a number of pieces here. And I don't follow Aubrey that much. I'm aware of him and, seems like a generally charming guy and, curious about lots of things. And, he's got a popular podcast. But this particular episode seems to have hit a real nerve within the collective, or at least a particular realm of the collective, because I started seeing a lot of responses come out around this, in Instagram and YouTube videos, and there was just a lot of folks that who I also am aware of were responding in their own particular ways about what this episode meant, who Aubrey is, or what the women were, falling sway to or not. Or it's just very interesting to track from that level how this triggered a real kind of collective response. And so I think it's important to say that up front, that in many ways, I mean, at least for me, that's one of the most interesting things about this is just to track it as a cultural phenomenon of why this particular conversation sparked such a response. And then also we can dive into the particulars. And Dace and I, we like to riff on a lot of these themes. We also involved in a lot of these territories as well. And so I sent the episode to Deus about a week or so ago, and I had started listening to it, and I was like, man, this is very interesting. I mean, on multiple levels. And Deus then took it up and listened to it. And a few days ago, both him and I posted our own responses to Facebook. And I would say my response had a particular inflection, which we'll get into in a bit, and his as well had his own inflection. And so I thought to invite a live conversation, or at least a recorded conversation, around both of our responses and see where we can kind of emergently go with this. And so that's my overture to this. And I'd be curious for you, Deus, what did you know going into the conversation about, Aubrey, or at least the terrain, other than maybe I just said, hey, you should check this out?
Almost nothing, actually. Very similar to you. I'm familiar with Aubrey. I'm not really following him. Occasionally, I tune into his podcast, and I've always found it to be really great, actually, like really insightful, really engaging. I listened to a few of his episodes on internal family systems with Richard Schwartz, and they went through like an actual live process, which was beautiful. But I didn't know anything about his relational situation or what he's been moving towards with his partner, with his partners. So all of it was new information for me. I think it's probably been about a year since I even tuned into his podcast. So I was going in green, kind of blind.
Mhm. So let's just sketch the episode, and maybe I can offer like a bit of the overture. So if somebody's listening, like, hey, what's this all about? What was the thing that triggered such a response? And how I understand it, or how I'll just do a little brief sketch of it, is that Aubrey, he has been in I suppose, a committed relationship he's married to a woman, Vailana. I don't know how long they've been together. I think it's maybe close to 10 years or something at this point. I understand there was an earlier period where they were together and they explored polyamory, and that, maybe didn't go super well, or it brought up a lot of stuff. And so they shifted more into, I guess, I mean, again, I'm hesitant to say it's committed monogamy, but it'll make sense in a second. But basically, they were existing and seemed to advocate for what's sort of become known as this divine union archetype, which, again, depending on who you speak to, is that can be very appealing. I would say that's like an archetype in the collective that certain, spiritual or relational influencers and facilitators and counselors, they kind of uphold this idealistic image of this divine union partnership. And then at the same time, there's this other sort of poly dynamic or poly advocates, which advocate for a sort of maybe an evolved or a different understanding of what a thriving relational field could look like. And Aubrey sort of outed himself in a new way, I suppose, with his partner and their lover, which her name is Ilana, I believe. There's Vilana and Ilana, which again is can be confusing. But again, to sketch it very briefly, Aubrey ended up sort of saying that he was sort of divinely inspired or pushed to reach out through a dating app. I understand it's an elite dating app to seek this woman when they were, on some trip, and then they ended up finding deep, incredible connection. He brought it into his dynamic with his wife, and I just as a clarification as well, I understand they were open already, like they were sort of monogamous-ish, or they had other lovers occasionally. That seems to be the case. So they brought in Ilana, and that seems to have sparked just a depth of connection or desire, and the rest with Aubrey that they began exploring as a triad. And I'll just say that the kind of biggest reveal in this journey was that at a certain point, I don't know how long into the relationship, maybe a year or so, they were in Egypt, I understand, and going to visit these, ancient temples. And there's the Temple of Isis. And Aubrey reveals how in the temple he was given a transmission or a download or a strong encouragement that he needed to impregnate both of the women, or that he had to have children with both of the women. And that was something that he, was shaken by, and he ended up telling his wife, Valana, and that created a huge stir. And I guess he shared it with Alana at some point. And again, so began a kind of reformation around what that could actually look like. To have children with two women. I didn't quite understand if it was like at the same time, but that there seemed to be a new relational form that wanted to take shape with them, and they began again the deep work to quote evolve this. And there's a lot to be said already about that. Is it that controversial? Is it not? But that they have a mentor also in the conversation, Mark Gaffney, who's a sort of evolutionary relational mystic, and there's a number of things that could also be said. And he's present in the conversation as he's been a mentor to the three, it sounds like, and a counselor. And he's sort of cheerleading them throughout the conversation. And, Deus had a lot to say about that particular dynamic, which I'll turn it over in a second. But they've essentially offered up that this relational, pattern of sacred relationship, as they've spoken about it, is a form of, they use the phrase, I think it was radical monogamy, right? Again, that this is actually it's not polyamory, it's something different. It's radical monogamy, and and then cheerleaded by Mark is like, yes, you're I don't know evolutionary mystics in the field of like blah blah blah. I mean, I can't remember the whole phrase he used. So there's just it's highfalutin spiritual language, I would say, which contains a lot of truth, though. And by truth, I mean things that a lot of people can recognize, like grappling with how to be more transparent in relationships, how to be true to desire, how to be, I don't know, disciplined and committed and in solidarity. And so there's just so many things that are sort of swimming in this cauldron. And again, it's triggered a number of scenes of people to respond in the way that what they think they're seeing, right? And some are seeing, wow, these are such evolutionary mystics, right? But then others are seeing, this feels like total spiritual bypassing and gaslighting and, a kind of reflection on the poly scene as a whole of charismatic men taking advantage of women. And so there's just a lot in there. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Deus, and I'd love to hear your take on, I mean, again, you wrote a lengthy Facebook post about it, but I'd be curious to hear, yeah. So what was your impression now wading into this territory of this conversation now with them?
Man, where to start? Uh, The way that I started my Facebook post is to preface it by saying, take everything that I say with a grain of salt. Because I think, I felt really uneasy as I listened to this episode. And it was tricky for me to even acknowledge that because I agree with a lot of the concepts and principles that they're presenting, and even a lot of the framing that they're putting on it. But the way that it was presented, something felt off, something felt wrong to me in that sense grew the longer I listened. And I think one of the main reasons for that was the presence and the contributions of Mark Gaffney. It was a very strange way to frame their story, to bring on the person who had been coaching and counseling. I mean, that's a great idea, but how the conversation unfolded was almost as though Mark was there to constantly affirm everything that Aubrey was saying. There was no challenge or criticism. There was no questioning. There was no inquiry. There was no organic discussion around anything that they were talking about. There was only nonstop encouragement and validation and support, and almost like building it up as this giant accomplishment, like he was just there affirming everything that was coming out. And that's really started to irk me because as I've dove into these spaces myself in my relationship with my partner, we are monogamous. There are some nuances there that I'll share in a little bit, but we're very dedicated to each other. I've been very fortunate to have a lot of different teachers and mentors and community members and friends, such as yourself, Ian, and others who have a variety of experience in this field, non-ordinary ways of relating, figuring out monogamous, monogamish, polyamory, open relationship, like what's the difference? How do we set up appropriate ethical boundaries to avoid causing harm and to be aware of power dynamics, things like that. I've had a lot of critical but loving feedback along the way that has kept me very tempered and helped to illuminate a lot of my blind spots. And to have people to call me out on the blind spots has been essential along the way. And one thing that I wrote about in my post was that I'm so grateful that I didn't have somebody there just pumping my tires, building it up as, yes, everything that you're wanting is divinely orchestrated. And Mark Gaffney uses this phrase over and over and over again, the holy and the broken, hallelujah. Like this whole pathway is the holy of holies, kind of thing, like celebrating it. And it made me uncomfortable because I think the questioning is not only a way of keeping ourselves humble, but it's also an invitation to share in more detail about the reservations, the hesitations, the authentic desires that might be challenged by uh, a relational configuration such as this. Like there wasn't a lot of space for Vailana, and Alana to actually share in detail about why they might not want this kind of configuration. And it became very clear that Vailana in particular has struggled a lot throughout this trajectory. And that was just kind of like glossed over as this necessary, painful point of spiritual growth to get to the point where they can say fully yes to this divinely orchestrated, emergent relational technology that has come about. It was just a lot of things that were irking me that were hard to pinpoint because I resonate with a lot of the concepts and principles that they're presenting. So I really had to sit with it for a while after listening to the podcast episode to, sift through my feelings. And there's this one word that I really love. It's called krivda, 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 and it means crooked truth, where something is being presented that is true, but it's wrapped around layers of distortion so that you don't get a sense of the shadow that's present there. And one of the ways to do this is to actually build it up and advocate for it as this 100% positive thing. There's a kind of undercurrent of advocacy for it, by elevating it, especially from a position of authority. So you have Aubrey, who's a wealthy, relatively powerful influence. And then you have Mark Gaffney, who's this spiritual leader, and both of them are, praising this new pathway in the highest possible terms. And that's basically what the podcast episode is about. It's about praising this new pathway they have landed in that seems to have been fully initiated and pursued by Aubrey. And I think that this is where a lot of the criticisms are coming from. It's like it doesn't feel like I got an honest sense of the women's experience of this. It felt like just by the nature of how everything was being framed, if they were to bring in their more challenging or critical experiences of what's been unfolding, that they might be perceived as being less evolved, or lesser,
Mm.
or just not having moved through their own shadow. And I'm not saying that that's happening necessarily, but this was a big part of my questioning around the whole thing. It just seems slightly off, and I couldn't shake that feeling of unease. And a lot of the reflections that I've heard from other sources about this podcast episode seem to share a lot of those sentiments. I haven't actually come across a public reflection about that podcast that was like celebrating or advocating for it. I'm curious if you have, because I most of what I've seen has been critical
Mhm.
analysis of what they were
Mm.
sharing.
Yeah, so a number of pieces here. I mean, it's interesting that the ability to be self-aware of the reasons not to proceed with something, right? Like that's a higher level understanding of things. And when this was presented, and I feel it was, at least on behalf of maybe Aubrey and Mark, and then maybe there's a lot that can be projected on them about their situation and about, like a lot of people feeling Vailana's um, tears at one point, right, around the challenges she faced, navigating this, and people then projecting their idea of like, oh, this means that she's actually, she doesn't want this, and she's just going along with Aubrey, and so it's tricky, right, because we always bring like our own perspectives to it. And yet at the same time, I think the overall tone of the piece was, even though they said a few times, this is us, we're not saying that everybody should do this, but the whole thing was very positive. It was presented very positively. And I think ultimately that the aim of the participants, again, maybe Mark and Aubrey and Vailana was kind of like expecting a degree of criticism, but overall high fives. Like that's kind of my
Yeah,
sense, right?
right.
Of like look at us, we're bold, we're trailblazing, and certainly there's going to be people upset with this, but we're going to get a lot of high fives. Like my suspicion is that was the case, and it seems to not have been the case. I think what's happened is by exposing themselves in this way, it kind of brought the mirror from the collective that was seeing a lot of things at play that they themselves were at least not willing to admit or aware of, right?
Yeah, or
So,
disclose.
yeah. And I say this in the sense that, getting feedback from people, again, can be hard. And especially when you're not, yeah, you're not kind of like willing to say, these are the blind spots that are possibly active, or these are the ways in which, maybe we shouldn't do this, or to kind of self-disclose in a way, which I would see that as a higher order of um, just self-awareness around a path that's, edgier. So that to me is a part of this like backwash from that. Now, the other piece too is interesting again, like those that project certain ideals on what relationship means, what a man should be, what a woman should be. That's also something I think interesting to take a look at because I listened to another conversation with three men who were basically strongly advocating for this divine union archetype. And they were saying, in no uncertain terms, that Aubrey, by one, even kind of be practicing polyamory or openness at all, was lesser of a man,
Hmm.
right? Because a man ultimately, and they use these terms, which I hadn't actually come across quite yet, but they called it biological imperative. Like
Hmm.
this idea that, again, men have a certain biological imperative, women have a certain biological imperative, and it's to men to provide and to support, and for women to nurture, to raise children, to tend the home. And again, it feels very nostalgic in a way to this kind of traditional idea of the nuclear family. But now with a bio imperative lens that says, again, a man is meant to be territorial over his woman. A man is meant to be in competition with other men and actually fight them off in a way that like that shows the women that, you know, you're a protector and she can trust you. And so there's a whole lens that they're putting on there. And so again, you know, there's lots to be said there. There's also the archetypal piece, which I think you spoke to in your podcast, or sorry, your Facebook post, where you said the masculine is about containment, and you know these other factors. So I'd be curious for you to speak a little bit about that in terms of the lens that you're bringing to this conversation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm curious about this biological imperative because the assumption there is that we're actually wired for monogamy, like both women and men. That's
Yeah,
essentially
they
what
were
that's
making that
asserting.
case. They were making that case. Yeah.
Right. I'm suspicious of that. I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, it could be argued, depending on where you're looking historically, that men have a greater tendency to actually, um, impregnate multiple women, to have multiple partners. And it's women's tendency to kind of anchor onto one man. Historically, this has been the case in many different cultures. So, are we biologically wired for monogamy? I'm not really sure. I can only
Mm.
speak from my own personal experience that there's been a tremendous amount of value in deepening in my relationship that was only available once there was deeper levels of commitment that were established, that opened up deeper layers to the relationship that I wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. So from my experience, that's where that's coming from. I'll pause there because you had something you wanted to share.
Well, just that I wanted to actually kind of bookmark this because also the folks that are tuning in from who have seen now my film with John Wolfstone and Julie Marianska on Tamara, the community. Also, the film itself is called The Village of Lovers, and I'm going to bridge in a moment after your share into some of the kind of lenses that I think lend themselves to this conversation. But I think it's just worth saying that maybe you're saying, you know, is monogamy like bio imperative or not, or are women meant to be this way? And I just want to say what I've come to understand is that the context of relating and power dynamics and safety and belonging all play a deep role in what is understood to be like an idealized form of relationship. So I just wanted to, you know, leave that little bookmark and then back over to you.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors here, and we don't really know what it would be like to live in a culture that had a different stereotypical frame around relationship. Especially with the influences of religion, with traditional family values, with the way our culture approaches sex and relationship just in general. There's a lot of assumptions that are made right out of the gate, such as sexual exclusivity, and moving towards cohabitation and a sharing of resources. That's assumed to be, the pathway that you're supposed to follow in relationship. How much of that is informed by the culture versus our biological imperative? I'm not really sure. But the work that you and I have done and the work that I've dove really deeply into over the last 5 to 10 years in particular is largely about questioning those automatic assumptions and to become curious about discovering what your authentic needs, desires, and boundaries are, not just in a sexual relationship, but in life as a whole, by starting to rekindle an intimate and clear relationship with this force of eros, which is the force of intimacy. And on one hand, I think it's a tragedy to limit that to a single person. First of all, it's putting a tremendous amount of pressure on them to fulfill all your intimate needs. And I'm not just talking about sexual needs, I'm talking about intimate needs like depth of contact, connection, um, attraction, arousal, not just sexual arousal, but that type of energizing that comes from deep contact, creativity, creation. To put all of that at the feet of one person is a huge burden. And this is how we also start getting pulled into like wounded mother, wounded father dynamics, codependency patterns, because we're limiting our access to that level of fulfillment, which is a human need, to a single person. But then the question becomes, how do we approach exploring erotic energy safely and consensually with appropriate boundaries? And that is going to be different for every person and every relational configuration. So on that point, I actually agree with Aubrey and the gang. I think it's worth exploring our relationship to attachment and possessiveness and jealousy. There is certainly a value, there's a purpose to those things. They're not bad or wrong in any way, but they are very, very highly charged, triggered responses that are worth investigating. What happens if we start unwinding the patterns that spawn that kind of reactivity? What kind of opens up if we don't have that level of almost like violent jealousy, and there's layers of trust that are required in order to get to that point, levels of surrender, vulnerability, emotional processing. All those things are extremely positive, but it doesn't mean that the goal that we're shooting towards is to just have no boundaries or agreements or protocols in relationship at all. This is a discovery process of unwinding the wounds from the past to see what can authentically unfold without the imprint of painful past experiences or cultural conditioning. And I don't have the answer of what that looks like because I think it's going to be different for every person, but this is what I'm interested in exploring. So I
Mhm.
appreciated that about the conversation. But one of the things I was really challenged by was some of the things that couldn't be verified that were coming predominantly from Aubrey and supported by Mark Gaffney, specifically around like the divine messaging of it all. Because in my experience, these types of intuitive insights, these spiritual downloads, are often filtered through our own personal biases and patterns and programs and blind spots. They're inexorably linked. There's no such thing as undistorted information coming into our consciousness. It's all being filtered through our own direct experience of things, our belief systems. So when he says something like, I was working out in my gym and I had this, spiritual message to check my app, check the dating app, and I never do this because working out is sacred for me. Like a phrase like that. Like, can't you just, like bring it down off the pedestal for a second? You're exercising. It's important for you to stay focused and, give yourself to that. And in that sense, everything is sacred. You don't need to tag that on as a way of elevating the singular moment. It's like I had the impulse to check the dating app. You can just say that. So it's like when things like that come in, it makes me question. And then later, when he talks about getting the download in the Temple of Isis, and he got really concerned, he never spoke once about considering not pursuing that, not pursuing the message to impregnate Alana. He never spoke about that possibility. It's almost as though that was received as this is the appropriate path. And it sounded as though the fear was that in presenting that to Vailana, that she would not be on board with it. And that led to a whole bunch of conflict to eventually get her on board with it. And we never got to hear about Alana's, how she responded to all of that, like what her experience with all of that was, and also what her relationship with Vailana is. Like, do they have a lovership? There's just so many questions here. And, in the absence of considering, okay, this is what the message is that I've received, what would it look like if we pursued it? And what would it look like if we didn't? And what are the consequences of both? They were only speaking about this one pathway, as though the divine messages that Aubrey is getting is the path that needs to be followed. And they didn't say that outright, but the way the conversation unfolded, that was the impression that I was getting. And I don't know if I trust those intuitive insights, not just for Aubrey, but for any person. I think there's a degree of discernment that's required to be able to distinguish between, okay, what is authentic spiritual guidance? What does that even mean? And how is that being wrapped up in your own shadow? So this is where my alarm bells were going off the longer the conversation was unfolding. And the fact that Mark Gaffney wasn't voicing any of these things, that he was just fully advocating for everything that they were saying, it made me question, especially because I don't know how much money Mark is getting, as their counselor, as their coach, how much he's invested in this configuration as a living example of the things that he teaches. There's
Mhm.
just too much personal investment in this being perceived and received in a positive way that it just makes me question the legitimacy of a lot of it.
Mhm. Well, this brings up piece two, which I think was one of the main points of criticism that I heard a number of times, which was the kind of like dressing up a more, you could call them, I don't know, baser desires or just like clear erotic horniness or something with spiritual language, right? Like if Aubrey was just like, man, I was super attracted to this babe, that younger babe, as an older man, like just kind of admitting that with honesty, I think may have dissuaded a number of the criticisms that felt like it was, yeah, it was kind of covering up that just straight up transparency with the, again, highfalutin spiritual language. And that also feels like it can come across as, yeah, manipulative, right? Or unconsciously manipulative and infusing just straight up, desire for, with again, a kind of transmission of the sacred and all this kind of stuff. So being able to distinguish between those things, and maybe part of that is true that, I received that message, but the other part is me that wanted that. Like as a man, if I'm
Mm.
like aroused by a certain possibility, it's like also owning that too. So I feel like
Mm.
that part wasn't as clearly stated. I want to shift gears a bit slightly now too to the other lens, which is around sort of what I was seeing when I listened to the conversation and bringing forth a number of my experiences in the community of Tamara, which, you've been there as well, which is great. And you weren't there for the love school, but you still experienced some of the, of course, the field there.
Mm.
I myself was one of the three filmmakers. We spent 10 years studying the community and also making a feature documentary about it. I attended four love schools there and it clearly had a deep effect on me. And a little bit more about my background is I was married in my 20s. The whole relationship was 10 years, but we separated after 6 years of the marriage, largely because of similar questions, though, around how to navigate a different relational terrain, where I desired for more, exploratory possibilities, and my partner at the time as well kind of wanted to stay with what we had, which was very kind of traditional monogamy. And ultimately, that desire to explore broke the relationship. And I ended up writing an essay about it, and there's in detail. But that led me into explore polyamory as well. For 5 years, I was in a polyamorous dynamic, a relationship with a partner who, for the last 2 years of that relationship, had another partner, another male partner. And so, a lot of the stuff is very, for me, it's coming from direct experience of, again, a lot of the challenges that came up for me in terms of navigating that territory, how little models we actually had for how to do that well. And so, there is a degree of compassion and empathy for Aubrey and crew to navigate territory, which again doesn't fit with the kind of idealistic, um, just relational dynamics that a lot of people are conditioned into, and stepping outside of that at all, it can actually create a lot of criticism and judgment and everything. So that's in there too. But I'll say for the last 7 years, I've been with my partner now. We share a young child. He's 6.5, he would say. And we've been largely exclusive. And I use the term now exclusive instead of monogamy, which is something I got from Jessica Fern, who wrote the book Polysecure. And again, there's reasons and nuance for that, which I appreciate. But I'll just say, so I've been kind of around a number of different constellations. And so I'm bringing that to this conversation. And so what I saw with this dynamic with Aubrey and them is I was really struck by, at least it seemed to be, again, I don't know their inner workings and their inner circles and this and that, but the role of community didn't seem that present in the way that I saw reiterated over and over again in Tamara as a kind of social design of the community.
Mm.
And how that looks specifically, and those of you who've seen the Village for Lovers film, you'll know what I mean. Others that have not seen it, check the show notes in the comments. You'll see a link to see the film. But there's two practices that I felt actually really were kind of mind-blowing to me that they used throughout the community. And one was the principle of embedment. And embedment is this kind of continual willingness to kind of like make visible your both like your actions and like your decision making processes and your thoughts around things. And if again, that sounds a bit hard to wrap your head around. Oftentimes, this was like whether it was decisions in the community about different projects that were going on, or love dynamics in the community. They practice what is known as they say love free from fear, but this idea that they create a social field where people can explore, with as much transparency and openness in a way as they like, but at the same time, there's no sort of expectation that they be a certain way. Like you could be celibate, you could be monogamous, but lo and behold, in a social field of trust, and this is going back to the comment I made in the past about the context in which we're practicing a relationship, but in a social field of trust and without a kind of expected constellation of relationship, that humans inevitably seem to be more open to explore in quote non-traditional ways when again there's a degree of trust and solidarity amongst the folks involved.
Mm.
That just seemed to be true, and they found that again and again when couples would come to the community. So embedment was a way of basically just saying, like, let's say you're sitting at the table at dinner, right, and you notice like a spark with another person in the space, right? You wouldn't just kind of steal off, to go off and have a tryst or whatever on your own. Generally, you would maybe make transparent to the group there and say, "Hey, wow, I'm feeling attraction to this, spark with this beautiful person here." And my curiosity is I'd love to, take them to a love space and explore further, for example. And the other person, if this case, if it was a woman, would say, like, how does that land? And the people at the table, for example, would be present to that and say, like, yeah, how does that land? And like they would mediate that spark of connection and that possibility through community. And that again is a lot of things. If somebody's going through a hard time, again, the willingness to just like voice it and then to get reflections and feedback from people as like an ongoing presence in the community was quite profound actually, because it embeds our kind of inner workings in the wider social field, to give us perspective that we might be missing, or to give us blind spots, or to give us that moment of pause. So, for example, like with Aubrey and Vailana and Ilana, there he shared a story about it sounded like very early on in their kind of exploration, maybe like a week or something. They went and did what's called a God bomb, apparently, right? Which sounded like, and I've heard some people talk about possibly like DMT and maybe a mix of other things. And they talked about, I was so incredible to be in that space. And, we really, experienced pure, love and connection or something.
Yeah, and
But
something about Alana, they're like, and you had an energy that we'd never seen before. It was incredible, like really
yeah,
building her up as special and unique.
yeah. And here we have again, if you take a step back from the situation, we have an older man. I mean, he's actually, by the way, interesting enough, Aubrey and I have the exact same birthday,
Mm.
like February 28th, 81, like exact same year, exact same. So I feel like a little bit of a kinship, but he's the older character in this. I think Ilana is maybe late 20s. I think I got that impression. And his partner, his wife is, I think, maybe late 30s. Again, I'm not clear on fully on ages, but Ilana is the younger one. And so here we have a situation where early on in their relating, he takes her and gives her DMT in a intense psychedelic experience to infuse it, and infuses it more with this like sacred aura. And so again, I wonder in a social field if they were sitting at a table, for example, at Tamara, and they said, "Hey, we want to take this woman we just met and go give her some DMT and rock her world. Like, what do you guys think?" Like maybe the people at the table would have said, "I don't know if that's a good idea, to be honest. That feels a little rushed, and maybe let's talk about this more." And so these kind of social ways of again mediating these kind of decisions that can feel very true and right in our minds and in our like tiny little bubbles can be just given a little breathing room, right? And slowed down when you have a social field with embedment, for example. And then the second piece I'll just name is the practice in the community of something called forum, which is again, a very powerful communal ritualized process of the community circling up and people going in one at a time to work on a process, right? Whatever that is. It could be a love, interest in the community. It could be an inner process, a healing dynamic or an issue in the community, this and that. And there's generally two facilitators within the forum space and community, and they'll guide the person through, to find some layer of truth is really the heart of it, is to like get to like what are the deeper layers present? Can we see them? Can you work with them? And ultimately come to this place of revelation. And so once that person goes through a process, generally it can be 10, 15 minutes, depending on the style. And then after that, the community is invited to come in and mirror the person, right? And to give feedback of like, oh, this is what I think I saw, or this is, have they considered this? And it's not advice. It's actually just like a very intelligent way of opening up a kind of, I don't know, mastermind organism around the processes. And some of it hits, the mark, and some of it is way off, and that's fine. But ultimately, it deepens the trust in the field, seems to be, right? When you know somebody's inner processes and maybe ways in which you're like, man, I can't stand this person. They're always doing this thing. And then they go into the circle and they unpack it of like, oh, this is kind of where it came from or what I'm working with, generally you leave like more compassionate and more like, wow, I see a lot of my own process in this, or wow, what courage to go in and do this work in community. And so again, I highlight these two pieces as like core kind of social technologies around how to mediate for things like grandiosity and narcissism, which relates more to this term. And it might have been John Woolstone who came up with this, my co-director. He uses the term relational ecology to speak to that. Ultimately, that's where the health of a system is within the diverse relational ecology that can help us navigate this terrain and our blind spots and their shadows and everything. And that when I look at the Aubrey situation, it doesn't seem to have the kind of relational ecology that would actually support finding a deeper, mediated truth within this process. And again, he's got Gaffney maybe like pumping their tires at the time, and like maybe they have an inner circle around them, right? Which is maybe they're also super into this relational dynamic, and so he's not getting other mirrors and other feedback until opening it up to hundreds of thousands or whoever, now in the wider public who are giving them strong feedback about what they see. And again, some of it no doubt hits the mark, and some of it again is their own others distortions. But I just see again the lack of relational ecology in order to have a thriving relational, truly evolutionary dynamic.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so important in any relational configuration to have input and perspective from the outside. Because regardless of what's going on, it's hard to actually see the dynamic that's unfolding while you're inside of it. This is why relational counseling and therapy and community support is so important for working through issues with your partner and also clarifying your blind spots. Because by the nature of blind spots, you can't see them, they're invisible. When you're embedded in a pattern, you don't recognize it until it's reflected back to you from some force that has, the 40,000-foot view. So I would agree with that. And that's kind of what I was pointing to in my own experience of having a whole variety of teachers and mentors and community members who I would go to receive support. And a lot of the feedback that I got, a lot of the advice that I got from some of my teachers when I first started exploring this territory was very harsh. Our personal story here is some of your listeners might have heard this already, but I grew up with some significant sexual trauma when I was very, very young that crossed a lot of wires for me, and that created a lot of problems for me as I was going through life. Anyway, as I started resolving that over the years, I my goal for exploring sexually and erotically largely gravitated around resolving my trauma, because I would have a fight or flight response in a lot of different situations that involved sexual possibilities, not even sexual contact necessarily, but sexual possibilities. My system would go into an activated state. And I really wanted to unwind that. And the first time I experienced the fullness of my erotic energy with no inhibition, it was intoxicating to the point where I was getting woken up for like 4 or 5 nights afterwards, just incredibly aroused because it's like this energy had been unlocked. And so I was just, I was in this inertia of this rushing river and I wanted to continue exploring. And it was extremely threatening for my partner. And so I was reaching out to a bunch of teachers to see how I should approach this. And one of my teachers said to me, "You need to approach this as a man, not as a boy." And that really hit me deep. And he said, "You have to move at the speed of trust and no faster. If you're if you're sincerely wanting to maintain this relationship that you're in with your partner right now, you have to move at the speed of trust and no faster." And that was not the advice that I wanted. At that time, I wanted a Mark Gaffney, you know, but that really served me, to temper that impulse and to lean more towards creating safety for my partner as the precipitating circumstances for my own explorations. And they weren't superfluous explorations. There was a very deep intentionality there for me that was important to my own healing and growth and development, the resolution of a deep wound. It wasn't the desire to start forming relationships on the side or anything, but it brought up so much from my partner that I realized that my life was now tethered to her. She was subjected to the consequences of my decisions. And if my chosen pathway was pushing her beyond her own edges, that was irresponsible of me to do, especially as a partner. It was a dishonorable thing to do. So I had to slow way down, and I started leaning more into my relationship and started exploring more with her to create the necessary foundation of safety and trust where she could authentically bless me in my explorations. And again, my explorations have all been in facilitated spaces with a very specific purpose behind them, you know, and to get to that point where she could authentically bless it, and then I could come back from that experience and unpack it with her, and she could feel gratitude towards the women who helped support me on my healing journey, was a tremendous thing, you know. But this was the biggest thing that I've learned, one of the biggest things I've learned in relationship, that if I'm sincerely dedicated to my partner, that I have to consider her process as a part of my process. I can't force her into my desired trajectory. And a big part of that journey has been about questioning my own desires, not suppressing my desires, but bringing a magnifying glass to the things, to the people that I'm attracted towards, that I want to pursue erotically, to slow that way down so that that initial charge can settle and I can see what actually wants to happen. Because that initial charge, that overwhelming attraction, is generally coming from a pattern, an unconscious pattern. And that is revealed when the slowness is invited, and then that's amplified by community reflection. you know like at one point, Aubrey says that his erotic energy is like a wild horse, and he
Stallion.
just he
Stallion.
a wild stallion, like he just has so much erotic energy, and it's like, rein in your horses, man. It's like, that's not an excuse. It's helpful to familiarize yourself with your erotic constitution, but that's not a pass for just playing out the patterns that are organically unfolding. That's where a lot of problems in relationship come in.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate the element that you're bringing in, because this is something that's really lacking in our culture, is that kind of, what did you call it, the relational ecology
Mhm.
of being embedded into a larger field of relationship, to not only just keep us accountable, but to create this kind of like field of integrity that's not built off of judgment, but is built on clear reflection and honesty, truth, trust, transparency, like full self-disclosure, to be weighed and measured by those who care about you, so that we don't unintentionally create harm in our
Mhm.
relationships. That's something
Mhm.
that's not really present in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. And, I think for the last piece of this conversation, what I want to invite, and again, with an eye to maybe some people saying, what can we do about it? Right. Or some kind of truly evolutionary approach. And for me, I think what people are speaking to is an understanding of how can you be a supportive presence as well to others who may be willing to share their inner workings of their relational journey, right? And I say this because too often, let's say, like, why don't more people share more about what's going on in their relationships for real, right? And, I've been in, and you've been in lots of spaces, in particular men's spaces, where men can speak about the struggles, right, they have in their relationships. And that's really the only, or maybe one of the very few places they feel safe enough to do it. Right. And a lot of people feel this way too. A lot of people, there's this whole thing of, oh, no, just don't air the dirty laundry, keep it behind closed doors. Right. You can really burden other people with, quote, your stuff in the relationship. And if people don't know how to hold it, then it can become like just burdensome and actually just take up a lot of room. And so for me, maybe the invitation is for all of us to get better at being actually supportive to each other and sharing more deeply our relational dynamics. Like, how to become actually co-conspirators in supporting each other. Because again, counselors can be great, uh, and at the same time, what I saw at Tamara was a very beautiful social field, right? Where at any moment you could engage with someone and say, "Hey, man, I'm working with this pattern," or like, "Hey, this is what's going on for me," and the person wasn't trying to. Well, one, generally, my experience was they were able to separate their own stuff from the situation, right? To be able to how to truly show up and like give clear mirrors or ask different questions or right? Because too often we're not aware of how certain situations will trigger our own into unintegrated stuff or like our own pain in relationship. So, for example, I think what was going on with the whole Aubrey situation is people maybe they feel like they've been in Vailana's seat, right? In a relationship where a man is like, I want to do this thing, and and you have to come along with it, and their boundaries were say crossed or they were pulled beyond their boundaries, and so then people look at that and say, yeah, that's happened to me, so that's why it's so terrible, and he shouldn't do that, and as opposed to say, well, look, this is what's triggered for me in this, because I've been in that seat. I feel like I've been in that seat. And how do we still show up more clearly and offer, again, perspective and feedback? And I would say a big piece too is not to choose sides too quickly or at all, right? Which often happens, right? And this can happen in the mainstream very quickly is somebody might say, oh, this struggle has happened in my relationship. And they can be like, oh, what a jerk. Or, yeah, you should leave him. Or she's terrible. Like, yeah, get rid of them. Or like this kind of quick to choose sides ism, maybe I'll call it, which is generally not helpful. I mean, of course, in situations of like serious abuse, things like that, that can be very helpful to say, hey, whoa, clearly lines are being crossed. We need to seek help and everything. That's not what I'm referring to here. I'm just talking about just the general mayhem, which seems to be the case for being in a relationship, especially at this time. How do we show up better to each other to truly offer support and feedback that can, come to help to come to relational clarity, help us each come to that again, rather than kind of amp up the distress and the conflict and the confusion, which I think is so often the case. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I largely agree. I believe that if someone's able to hold a degree of dual awareness of that there's pros and there's cons to everything, there's consequence to every decision, rather than that's bad, this is good, that's wrong, this is right. It opens up a field of discovery because you're approaching it with a greater level of curiosity rather than this myopic lens of moral
Mm.
judgment, moral framing.
Yeah,
Because
like
the truth
divine
is,
union right, polyamory wrong, or like as
exactly.
opposed to like, okay, well, for me, divine union's right, but maybe polyamory is something you want to explore, and maybe I help you find the truth of that, or maybe it isn't. Like, yeah.
Yeah, there's pros and there's cons to each. There's consequences to each, but there's also certain considerations that you need to take into account depending on the choices that you're making. And it's a lot easier to have those kinds of conversations if it's not coming from a judgmental lens of you're doing something bad, you're doing something wrong. But there also has to be space to name the things that have harmful consequence or potential harmful consequence and to name those honestly. While also like affirming the potential benefits. Like I did this in my post about like really celebrating Vailana of I really believe there's a tremendous amount of goodness that can come from being willing to lean in and through your painful edges, and her dedication and devotion to Aubrey and their relationship and their path and herself and her relationship to spirit is very admirable and noble. And what was very clear to me is that she has received a lot from this journey. I don't think that she's a victim. She's also an adult. She's also making her own choices. But at the same time, there's also factors that need to be named, such as power dynamics, such as resources, such as influence, such as public reputation. All of these things are factors that need to be named and taken into account. And if they're not being honestly disclosed, then, there's a red flag that shows up there because something is being hidden or distorted. So there needs to be these honest conversations where we can acknowledge the value and the consequence of any particular path because there is no right or wrong. There's just consequences to our choices.
And I wonder if they, again, Aubrey and Vailana and Ilana, uh, regret actually putting this podcast out. I mean, I haven't seen some follow-ups. There was an initial follow-up where it seemed like Aubrey was a bit like doubling down a bit, like, I'll be the scapegoat or I'll be the. So it feels a bit of an initial kind of like I'll be the martyr, don't worry, kind of vibe. And maybe that shifted or not, but I have heard some other commentators say like even the ones that were heavily critical of that situation are like, but gave a reason to have this conversation and to spark quite a just a bubbling, response to a lot of these themes, which maybe folks now feel through this example that they can speak to. And so again, that's some value certainly. It's a lot. I'm sure the psychic backlash that they've been through, I think, because of this. And I wouldn't be surprised if honestly this actually shifts something significant in their dynamic from this point on. Like it may, and bless their journey and whatever that looks like. But I just think that yeah, that there's a real consequence that they may, and maybe a bit of a kind of a scorpion's tail of the whole kind of public vulnerability influencer culture, which, it has a degree of, hey, look at us, we're doing something amazing and we want to let you in on it. But now that let you in on it is like a lot of yeah, criticism, backlash, and I have no doubt that they're feeling a lot for it. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And who knows, maybe that's a result of them having not done that prior to this podcast episode, of actually
Mhm.
exposing and revealing the details of their journey to people who could offer them those critical mirrors, before landing
Yeah.
in a place where they're trying to advocate for something
Yeah.
with, 100% elevation in the highest possible terms. There's a reason why they're getting the feedback that they're getting right now. And I trust that. And we'll see what happens in the relationship. I hope it works out for them. And I'm sure it will in whatever direction it takes. But these kinds of conversations, like what you were saying at the very beginning, the fact that it's touched on some sort of cultural zeitgeist and initiated a lot of these conversations is positive in its own right. So gratitude
Mm-hmm.
for them for being willing to expose themselves and spark that conversation and to bear the weight of the consequences of that, because that's a sign of maturity. So I hope they
Mm-hmm.
can receive that in a good way.
And I'll say for folks who have not seen The Village of Lovers yet, this is the film around Tamara, and it really shows actually a lot of these pieces in action. And also doesn't, am I or imploring you as well as to not see Tamara as some sort of utopia that's figured everything out. But they've certainly brought forth some very powerful and I think important keys in terms of how do we create more diverse and robust and resilient social fields, particularly around, love and relationship, but really just how do we regenerate trust amongst each other. That's like a huge piece. And so you're welcome to stream the film. Check it out, thevillageoflovers.com, as well as just a note from about Deus and I and the kinds of spaces that we create, which are primarily focused for men to navigate the terrain of eros and shadow and love and all this stuff that Deus and I have been stewarding spaces like this for men online and in person. And you're welcome to check it out at themythicmasculine.com. I'll be a link to the show notes of our upcoming in-person retreats as well as the online offerings that we have. Any last words, Deus?
Just thanks for being a steward of these kinds of conversations. I love having an ally and a friend that I can jam on these things, even if our perspectives don't fully align. It's nice to, be walking parallel with someone who I consider to be a friend. So thanks for having me on and having the courage to initiate these kinds of conversations. I appreciate the platform.
Thank you, brother. And thanks to you, dear listener. Onward we go.